Terri Butler, authorities in PNG are reported to be angry that three Australians facing rape and other allegations at the Manus Island Detention Centre have been whisked back to Australia, if I can characterise it like that. What are your concerns here?
Well, Chris, my concerns about Manus Island are the same as they've ever been, which is that the way this government is allowing Manus Island to be run, the detention centre facility, I mean, of course, not the island itself, is very disturbing. In fact, our entire caucus last year voted on a motion expressing our grave concerns about the way that the coalition is managing both offshore detention centres in Manus Island and Nauru. This is just another report that lends significant weight to our concerns about whether these facilities are being run properly. I mean, this is a government that has moved to, for example, take away the rights of asylum seekers and refugees who are still in detention centres to sue. We've opposed that legislation, as you know. This is a government that can't be trusted when it comes to how they handle asylum seekers and refugees, to the extent of claiming secrecy over on-water matters instead of being transparent and upfront with the Australian people. This is a government that continues to damage our relationship with transit countries, and I particularly mean Indonesia. There are so many problems with this government's approach to managing all of the policy issues in respect of asylum seekers and refugees, but I'm particularly concerned about what is being done to protect and care for some of the most vulnerable people in the world who are awaiting refugee status determinations in detention centres in Manus Island and Nauru.
The complaint here from the PNG authority seems to be that this is PNG soil, and yet their sovereignty has been compromised, that they haven't been able to question these Australians.
The government's blundering around annoying countries all over the place. You'll recall Indonesia making the same comments in respect of government unilateral action in their waters. This government needs to remember that asylum seeker and refugee policy isn't just some sort of issue that they can use as a wedge domestically to cynically win votes from us. It's actually a very complicated and delicate issue that affects not just the lives of those people who are fleeing persecution and seeking our help, but actually affects Australia's international relationships within our region, and more broadly for that matter.
So in this particular case, should the government facilitate the return of these three Australians so they can be questioned by the authorities in PNG?
Well, I don't know the details of the case. I've seen one news report, which I assume is what you've seen as well. I'm not going to give the government specific advice about how to deal with the concerns that have now arisen in respect of an erosion of sovereignty on PNG. But I would say this. People are looking to this government and saying, what are you doing to ensure that you're not damaging international relationships? What are you doing to ensure that people who are waiting for their refugee status determinations, and most people who are in Nauru and Manus Island are found to be refugees. So therefore, I mean, I've said it before, but we're talking about some of the most vulnerable people in the world who are fleeing persecution. And Chris, I don't need to tell you this, but you talk to refugees who have settled in Australia, and some of them have fled torture, have fled significant trauma. What is our government doing to protect the interests and the well-being of people waiting for their refugee status determinations? I don't think it's a question.
On this particular report, how serious is the allegation? How serious should we take it that somehow the Immigration Department has facilitated the removal of these men before they can be questioned by the PNG authorities? How serious should we take that allegation?
Look, I don't know who's... As I say, I've read one report. I don't have sufficient information to know how likely it is that this has occurred. We'll wait for what the government has to say about that. We don't run the Immigration Department, as you know. We're not in government. I prefer that we were in government and that Kevin Rudd was still the Prime Minister, but unfortunately that's not the case. My only position, and the only thing I want to say about this, is that I'm actually gravely concerned that the politicking from the Liberals and Nationals on this issue, and frankly the politicking on the left from the Greens, that tries to reduce every issue about asylum seekers and refugees to a vote winner against the Labor Party, is incredibly reckless, not just in respect of the way that the futures and lives of those refugees are affected, but also in respect of the way that the entire national interest is affected when it comes to our regional relationships.
Okay.
I would like the Abbott government to do something about that.
Okay, moving on, the whole issue of political donations was back in the headlines this week. The New South Wales Liberal Premier Mike Baird has called for reform of the system of political donations. One thing he'd like to see is coordination between the different states and the federal government, so the rules are the same. Do you think he's onto something here?
I wouldn't trust a Liberal state premier on political campaign finance reform as far as I could throw them. And as far as I could throw him, because it's usually a him. In fact, it's always a him, right? I wouldn't trust a Liberal on campaign finance reform as far as I could throw him, and it usually is a him when it's a Liberal. Frankly, if you look at what happened in my state of Queensland, in 2009, Anna Bligh brought in integrity and campaign finance laws that increased disclosure and transparency, that changed the way that campaigns could be funded by third parties and by political parties. And the minute Campbell Newman got into office here, he took an axe to those campaign finance laws and disclosure laws.
Yet on the other hand, the Liberals in New South Wales are the ones that have banned donations from concerns industries like gambling, from property developments. They've gone a lot further than any Labor state. Doesn't Mike Baird have some credibility due to that?
How many Liberals got knocked off by ICAC for getting around
how many
those?
Labor MPs got knocked off by ICAC too?
Come on. You cannot trust the Liberal Party on campaign finance reform. In fact, you know what, Chris? We disclose everything that's above $1,000. Every donation that we get, we disclose above $1,000. Even though federally, I'm not required to disclose anything that's under $13,000.
Well, isn't that a problem? Shouldn't you have to declare donations that are $1,000 or more?
Of course we should, and that's why we do it, and that's why our national conference over the weekend committed to campaign finance reform, committed to transparency and disclosure improvements. I'm just not going to be lectured to by a Liberal Premier about this issue, when in my experience, all the Liberals want to do is to have less transparency and disclosure obligations, lower thresholds, and when thresholds are lowered, they want to get around them using loopholes.
And yet, Fairfax is reporting today that the Victorian ALP government still hasn't made clear where millions of dollars of donations came from 8 months after the state election. I mean, surely both sides of politics don't exactly have a clean record when it comes to political donations.
People need to do more, but I'll tell you what, Anastasia Palaszczuk, one of the first things she did was to say, not only are we going to bring back the $1,000 threshold, we're going to make it retrospective so that everyone knows exactly where the money has been coming from in Queensland. We have a consistent track record in Labor in Queensland that I'm very proud of, and I've been a long-time supporter of increasing transparency. And federally in Labor, we have made it very clear that we believe the donation threshold for disclosure should be $1,000, and that is our practice. It's not our legal obligation, but it's our practice. So we work very hard on this issue. I went to a speech a decade ago of Julia Gillard talking about these issues, and since then Labor has moved on a range of them. The fact is, we all know that Australia's political process needs more transparency, and that there are good arguments for reforming the way that campaigns are financed, which is a much broader issue than transparency, as you know. But I'm not going to cop a lecture from Mike Baird or Tony Abbott for that matter. I mean, these are people who are part of a party that has a long tradition of trying to avoid transparency and disclosure.
Isn't this a problem in Australian politics, though, that when someone on the opposing party does do something that's praiseworthy, that we're incapable, that the political parties are incapable of giving credit where credit's due?
It's not true at all. It's actually not true. Here's an example. Last parliamentary sitting week, we agreed to back the government on the petrol excise changes. It's just not the case that we criticise and oppose everything that the other side does, and it's just not the case that they criticise and oppose everything we do. But that doesn't mean that because people don't like the fact that there is disagreement in a democracy that we should just sit down and shut up when it comes to issues on which we do disagree. As it happens on this matter, I'm pretty happy with our track record when it comes to campaign finance and disclosure improvements, as I said to you. Anna Bligh's done it, Anastasia Palaszczuk has done it, our federal conference over the weekend has agreed to do it. This is something that we believe in. This is not a situation where Mike Baird's saying, let's make campaign finance more transparent, and we're saying no. We are ahead of the curve when it comes to campaign finance disclosure. I'm just not going to cop a lecture from a Liberal on this issue when I know what their track record is.